Well, hello and welcome to an overview of our finished orcs. Over the last few weeks or so, we have been painting these. I've been painting these orcs and you've been following along. If you haven't seen those videos, definitely go back and take a look at those. These are Army Painter Orks, painted with the Army Painter new speed paints. So I'm calling them the Army Painter Orks. There's 5 of them, and I wanted to show you a 360-degree view of each of them. Starting with this one is number 1. This is painted in the Army Painter Speed Paints with the primer of the Army Painter Matte White. I have to say this is kind of the default. This is the one to beat. Army Painter says, yeah, you've got to use a white primer under these. That's their recommendation. And so I have for this guy, and he turned out great. We have no metallic paints here, so the gray is looking good. I have to say, I am very pleasantly surprised. These speed paints are working out well for me, and so I want to give you a little bit of an overview of these. But this is not quite my final thoughts on speed paint, because I've only tried the ones in the starter kit. Alright, so there's that first guy. Let's swap out to the next one. And the next one we have coming up here is the Citadel Gray Sear. So this orc was primed with Citadel Gray Sear. This is a bit of a darker paint primer than the white Army Painter primer, of course. I mean, it is a gray. However, overall, it is not a whole lot darker. You can kind of see on the base there. I'm going to rim these bases in my classic orange, but I have not done that yet. And see, it's just a little bit darker. The colors, though, come out about the same. They do work a little bit differently. They behave a little bit differently. I didn't notice that one was what I would call good or bad, just that they are, in fact, different. And so you might try them to see if you have a preference. My preference is I like how they go over the Army Painter white primer better, but honestly, the difference is so small that if I happen to have a can of the Gray Sear paint, which of course I do, I have that and the Army Painter, I'll probably end up using both for various things. Up next here we have the Rustoleum 2X. And so this is a dark gray, I would say a dark gray primer. It is not a bright primer. It's probably middle-of-the-road-ish gray, and I would say it's about a match to the Army Painter Dungeon Gray. Now, Army Painter does not have a spray of the Dungeon Gray, but that's the color I used for touch-ups, and I actually touched up a little bit on the base, but you can't see the touch-ups. You can see where I messed up my speed paint, but the touch-ups blend in very well, so it's about that same color. For me, I have to say, if you want to go cheap, this is the primer to use for cheap. Now, honestly, it's only about half the price of the Army Painter, so I would say it's totally worth it to get that Army Painter white primer. This definitely gives a darker, more of a grimdark kind of look. In fact, even with all my bright studio lights here, you see this orc is definitely dark. So do keep that in mind if you're using this primer. It is a great primer for a lot of things, but speed paint isn't one of them. Our next one here, this is the one that I was most surprised at. This is Citadel Deathguard Green. I got this primer by accident. Well, not really. I mean, I ended up, buying it on purpose, but I went to my local Games Workshop store looking for some Wraithbone primer because I was going to prime some Beast Snaga Orks, and I wanted to use a lighter primer, and I don't like the Citadel white primer, so I was going to go with Wraithbone. Well, they were out. So I told the person who was working there, says, well, what else could I use? And he said, well, you're painting orcs, and we talked a little about what are you painting? I'm painting orcs. Why don't you try this Deathguard Green? And that worked great for my Beast Snagas. And then I had it and thought, well, I'm going to try the speed paint. Wow, am I pleasantly surprised by this one. The colors still turn out to be the colors. So, like, green is still green. I mean, over green, of course, that's not a big surprise, but the blue is still blue, and it's not a real tealy blue, and the brown is still brown. In fact, I think the wrap on the barrel of his gun turned out probably to be the best, kind of like my flagship use of speed paint. It just looks so good. So this guy really turned out. Big surprise here. I'm surprised by it. I would actually paint an entire orc army using this primer and the Army Painter speed paints. That's how much I really like how this turned out. It's dark, but it's not too kind of grim dark. Even the gray paint on his little hair tuft thing turned out just fine. I didn't want to wait for the black. I don't have the black of the Army Painter speed paint yet. So this is my sort of number one surprise here is, wow, Deathguard Green? Who knew? That is awesome. Finally, the kind of late comer to the show, and that is the Army Painter BrushOn Primer. So the other four are spray cans. I did the shake up the can, you spray them. That's what I used for those. This guy is the BrushOn Primer. It's the actual, like, comes in a bottle. This bottle right here, BrushOn Primer, is exactly what I use. I brushed it on this whole miniature, and wow, am I impressed with how the speed paints worked over it. Honestly, I had no hope for this or the Rustoleum Gray. I thought it was going to be too dark, it wasn't going to work. Honestly, I had no hope for the Deathguard Green either. But science, right? And so this turned out way better than I'd ever thought, and you can do this no matter your situation, right? You don't have a place to spray paint, right? Is the weather really horrible where you live and you just can't find a day that works for spraying? I have occasionally a good day for spraying when it's not too cold or too humid where I live. But honestly, I could think of a situation where, worse than where I'm at, you're going to want to be doing a BrushOn Primer or like an airbrush primer or something. If you say, I don't want to buy an airbrush, well, this BrushOn Primer, great with the speed paint. So I would even be willing to say, new painter, if you're a new painter, you want to try these speed paints out, grab a BrushOn Primer, brush on your primer, get on, put the speed paints on there, and just look at what you can do with a paintbrush. That's all this guy is. He's just painted up with a paintbrush. He's also the only one with the slug and chop instead of the shoota, so he likes to break the mold. So there you go. There are the 5 primed orcs and how they're looking with that speed paint over those different primers. I am calling them done, except for 2 things. Number 1, I am going to rim all the bases in my classic orange rim that I use on my orcs. I'll show you an example of that here. Here's my classic orange rim, so we're going to do the orange rim on all of them. And then this guy that's on the turntable right now, he needs a little bit of basing material on that base, so I'm going to throw some glue on there and use some of the Army Painter basing materials on there, and maybe even put some paint on over that. But otherwise, they're all done. I'm going to be throwing them into my orc kill team. I just have a regular old compendium greenskins kill team that runs a bunch of shoota boys because I like to just run the shoota boys, and I just think it's kind of fun. So that's what I'm going to be using these for. Overall, this is not my speed paint review, but I will give you the impression is these are working great. These speed paints are working great. I have no complaints. I did not have any real issues with reactivation. Did it happen? Yes. Did it really bother my process? Not really. I documented it for YouTube, but other than that, I could have pretty much just ignored it and not worried about it. Would I recommend them? Yes, as an initial thing, I'll say yes, I'll recommend them. Do I like them better than the Citadel contrast paints? I would say that's a yes, with the caveat of I've only been able to get a hold of those 10 Army Painter colors in the starter kit. So those ones that I've used, I do like better than my experience with the Citadel contrast paints. Though Citadel does have a few more colors, and so as we start to explore that, We might find some things where, you know, you're kind of dipping into both. I think that's completely fine. Would I recommend this to new painters? Yes, I would. I think it's a fine kit. Grab the starter kit, grab single paints of ones that you need beyond that. Absolutely great. Would I recommend Citadel contrast paints to a new painter? No, I would not. They are much more expensive. I think there's better options out there from, even if you're stuck with Citadel, grabbing a few colors in like some Agrax Earthshade is a better beginner option there. That isn't to say I don't also recommend the Army Painter sets, beginner. Absolutely, grab the Army Painter beginner sets with their dark wash or their strong tone or something. Sure, but I would say I do recommend the speed paint for beginners, whereas I just don't the Citadel contrast paints. That's just my take on it, and take that information and use it how you will. So if you're thinking about trying out the Army Painter speed paints, go grab that starter kit from your local game store. They hopefully still have some in stock. I did grab mine, of course, but then I was at my local game store the other day, and they have ran out, and they have not been able to get more in just yet, though they are on the way, so you'll probably have some luck with it if you stop on by. Anyways, just kind of a talking video here today, so hope this was helpful so you can kind of see the orcs, and then I get something out to you here this week. This is going to be a little bit slower this week and next week. Life is busy at the moment, so if you're following along live or subscribed to the channel, then you're just going to see a little bit of a delay on the speed paint videos. That should pick up here once we get the new speed paints in and I start testing those out. All right, well, thanks for watching. Take care.